This is a brief presentation on the history of shock, the physiological phenomenon of shock. Now, as an example of how we use shock, at a recent night when I was on call at a local hospital, I had these two patients who arrived. One was shot in the left front and side, and he was hemodynamically stable and was alert, oriented times 3, and skin was dry and pink. He looked pretty good. His cousin had similar gunshot wounds, right costal margin, left flank, but he had a very rapid pulse and a low blood pressure. He was apathetic and disoriented and pale, diaphoretic. This gentleman was in shock. So, who are we going to operate on first? Well, turns out we're going to operate on the guy who's in shock first. Well, what is it that makes somebody shocky? And more to the point, how have surgeons thought of this idea, this word shock? Where does it come from? And what is it meant to say that someone is in shock over the history of surgery? And how is this understanding of shock guided therapy? Well, shock comes from the French word choc, from choquer. I guess originally, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, used to describe what happens between two jousters at the moment of impact. Notice definition number 4, the sudden debilitating effect produced by severe injury. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary ascribed this to Larrey, the great French surgeon, in 1791, but Larrey was not the first to use this. I'm going to show you who was in just a second. The American College of Surgeons uses a more mathematical approach in defining at least hypovolemic shock, the sort of shock that trauma surgeons most frequently see. And it's classified according to the Committee on Trauma's Advanced Trauma Life Support course into class 1 through 4. And you can see the various amounts of blood volume which would be lost. From a 70 kilogram man, this would be the volume of blood that would be lost to account for this amount of percentage of blood volume lost. I draw your attention to the mental status part of the system, where patients in more mild forms of shock are apprehensive, then become progressively anxious and combative, and then apathetic and comatose. Now, from a more scientific standpoint, or if you're ever taking a standardized test, that you should consider shock to be a state of inadequate tissue perfusion. Now, this is a great intellectual definition. It's often not that useful at the bedside to say, well, this patient looks better or more poorly perfused than the next. So here's another patient from a recent day at the hospital, and he presented at 9:30 but wasn't taken to CAT scan until 10:30. And was not thought by people to be that sick, although he was intubated for his belligerency, which was attributed by those caring for him to his intoxication. Well, this is what was found in the CAT scan, which is there's some extravasated blood coming from his ruptured spleen. It turns out that this fellow was in shock, and he snuck right past a number of talented physicians and nurses who completely missed it. Well, I'm going to divide this lecture into 6 periods in the history of shock. And we'll begin where most discussion of surgery begins, with Galen, and we will end with the modern authorities on shock, such as Hassan Alam and others. So, who was Galen? Claudius Galen, born in, or about 129 of the current era, was born in Pergamon, part of the Greek Empire. And in Pergamon, he gained some notoriety as an expert surgeon to gladiators. This drew his attention to those back at the home office in Rome. He was very quickly brought to Rome, where he ascended to be the surgeon to Marcus Aurelius, and later Marcus Aurelius' son Commodius. he wrote a lot and got quite a lot wrong. Someday we'll do another presentation on the anatomy and physiology of Galen. Galen was a monotheist, though, which drove the Catholic Church to give his theories and proposals ascendancy over others, and his ideas dominated the next 45 generations. In fact, Galen is probably the most influential physician ever to live, and yet he got most wrong. And Galen, of course, was a heir to the Hippocratic view that the physiology was driven in humans by four humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, and that blood was a hot humor, and that fever and inflammation therefore required reduction of the hot humor or bleeding. And while Galen in his 500 works does not describe something resembling shock, he did claim to have never lost a patient, and one presumes that if gladiators are your patients and you've never lost one, then you must be able to recognize shock when you see it, so that you don't choose to manage any patients who are in shock. There is a Hippocratic notion of eczemia, which is referred to in other works, but is not present, at least that I can find, in the Hippocratic corpus. And I draw attention to the Moorish physician Albucacius, also referred to as Ibn al-Zawahiri, who lived in Cordoba in the last century of the first millennium. Albucacius was probably the finest example of Muslim learning and surgery, at least in Moorish Spain, although much of his work is lost also. So shock entered the medical lexicon in 1743 with the translation of a work by Henri-François Ledran of a textbook entitled in English Reflections on the Management of Gunshot Wounds, which was published in French in 1741, translated into English in 1743. The English translator inserted the word shock in the book, and it is widely misreported in many textbooks and papers on shock that this was a mistranslation of the word secousse, meaning to jar, or the original French word of shock, but neither of these occur in the original text. In fact, here's an example from a Indian Journal of Anesthesia, example of this urban legend about the origin of the word shock. Where does it really come from? Well, here are the two books, the original on the right and the translation into English on the left, printed by John Clark. The translator is not recorded. And here's an example. This word saisissement in this case translated as oppression. Here, saisissement translated as shock. Here, saisissement et la commotion translated as shock and agitation. Here, saisissement translated as the shock. And we see this continues. So it's either commotion here, translated as shock, and saisissement as oppression. Saisissement as oppression and commotion. Saisissement as shock. This goes on. So I hope I've convinced you that I've at least read the two books. So what was this saisissement? Well, saisissement in modern French is roughly means to be thunderstruck or shocked, as in I was shocked to see a plane hit the World Trade Center. But in the 19th century and 18th century, it also had a meaning of nervous excitement. And we perhaps find the best context for this in this a text from the translation, where the shock and agitation which commonly follows gunshot wounds will be sufficient to suspend the laws of economy for a few minutes. The laws of economy, of course, not being the the law of supply or the demand curve, but in fact, meaning patients are agitated. Much like our missed shock patient earlier, who was belligerent and agitated, and yet not thought to be in shock, but Ledron might have recognized him as, in fact, suffering from saisissement. So, by any other name, agitation, commotion. And Ledron believed that this was a nervous phenomenon. He did not believe that this was due to a blow or a physical shock. He thought it was a nervous phenomenon driven by the central nervous system. In the next lecture, I'll pick up our talk with the work of Billroth and bring us through the 19th and 20th century. Thank you.